Chris O'Connor here. Join the Curmudgeon Rock Report's invite-only curmudgeonly community at facebook.com/curmudgeonrock. Also look out for a Spotify playlist that pays honor to this episode.
This is the Curmudgeon Rock Report, and this is your podcast made by rock geek iconoclastic outsiders for rock geek iconoclastic outsiders. For those of you who lament that rock music has gone the way of jazz and slipped into niche genre status, we are here to keep that flame alive by providing insight, analysis, recommendations, and honest takes, not hot takes. And hey, there's a good chance you'll learn some rock history you never knew before. On our last episode, part 1 of the first golden age of rock, Chris and I delved into the origins of rock and roll, how Black America in the South basically took rhythm and blues and added elements of country music and gospel to create this unbelievably exciting mongrel hybrid music. We discussed some of the great Black American artists who were the true pioneers of the genre and helped nudge it into the mainstream. However, by 1956, it would be a certain young white guy from Memphis, Tennessee, who would really make rock and roll cross over in a gigantic way, opening the mainstream floodgates for rock artists, both white and black, and forever changing the course of pop music. Sure, like what happened with jazz, black music was co-opted by corporate America and given a white face to appeal to white teenagers. But let's not minimize the greatness of artists such as Elvis Presley, Jerry Lee Lewis, Buddy Holly, and the Everly Brothers. Their rock and roll contributions were every bit as authentic and important as those of Chuck Berry, Little Richard, and Bo Diddley. It's all rock and roll, and it's all good. So, let's take a trip on that rock and roll time machine and go back to an era where raw, primitive, primal rock music was the hottest thing in pop music, and then suddenly dissipated due to a series of seemingly cataclysmic events, as well as the music industry watering the genre down to a harmless pulp. What the hell happened? Don't worry. Yours truly, Curmudgeons, are on the case as we give you the finale of the first golden age of rock.
Now, Arturo, very excited to do this second part of our series on the first golden age of rock, which covers the area of 1954 to 1959. Now, the beginning period of that. Now, you remember in history that polio was a big deal back then, right?
Well, I don't remember, but I read about it. Yes.
Yeah, exactly. Oh, yeah, we remember. Yeah, 21 years before we were born. But okay, so 54 is the year that Jonas Salk comes up with the vaccine for polio, and so there was a scourge of that era. Well, fast forward, 68 years, and there's a scourge known as COVID-19. And wouldn't you know that it finally found its way to me and my wife? Somehow, we Thanksgiving dinner in Austin, it was me and my outlaws and COVID-19. Everybody caught it, which was kind of strange.
Did you say me and my outlaws?
Me and my in-laws. But if it was my outlaws, far as I know, we don't have any bank robbers or anything. Yeah, I mean, well, and tell you the truth, they're like the nicest, quietest people ever, and so and because Jenny's brothers are engineers, and my mother-in-law was a school teacher, so it's like, yeah, try kicking off that conversation. I mean, I probably 80% of the talking comes from me. But then again, 80% of the talking usually comes from me anyway. I mean, shit, you've known me for 30 years and I still haven't stopped talking in your ears, So it's, What are we gonna do? Anyway, how you doing, man?
Good. Speaking of talking, I should probably do less of it because I made a big mistake in the last episode, the part one of this first golden age of rock. When I talked about Elvis, I mentioned Elvis's first single on Sun Records that he recorded in
It's all right, Mama.
1950. It's all right, Mama. And I credit it to being written by Big Joe Turner. I was mistaken. It was written by Arthur Crudup, a different blues musician, a rhythm and blues guy. It was Arthur Crudup who wrote That's All Right, Mama, not Big Joe Turner. That's number one. Number two, I alluded to this in our Facebook group last week, but a very, very heartfelt RIP to Christine McVie, the co-singer, co-songwriter, and keyboard player from Fleetwood Mac, who passed away. Very sad to hear that.
Yeah. Well, I mean, that's indicative of the passage of time. She was 79 years old, which means, we're to the point that, as a friend of mine says, the 20th century keeps dying.
Yeah.
We're to the point now where, like, Little Richard was alarming 2 years ago. And now it's like, oh, shit, now it's Fleetwood Mac.
Yeah.
So Fleetwood Mac is dying. One thing to say about Christine McVie, by far the most consistent songwriter in that band. And I just Tusk would have been one of the most schizophrenic albums ever, but Christine McVie's output on that album is amazing.
Yeah,
and Stephen Nicks comes through with one song, so that is a damn near perfect album. One of my favorites of all time. You remember McVie actually goes back to 1970. She worked on all those albums with Bob Welch and Peter Kerwin. Before Lindsay and Stevie came in and broke them. So, and she wrote some pretty good songs back then, but I think having Lindsay and Christine were actually each other's muses as songwriters. Because remember, they co-wrote like several songs together, and I guess, Lindsay's production or whatever, Christine McVie was at her best. Maybe another one of her legacies was that she dated Dennis Wilson for a little bit and lived to tell the tale.
Yeah.
So that's admirable. But anyway, R.I.P. Christine McVie, one of the great underrated songwriters of all time. So with that said, speaking of underrateds, we're now getting in the phone booth, and instead of the past, we are going through that little wormhole in the space-time continuum, and we are now in the parallel universe. This is a parallel universe that we visit every episode of this podcast, and over there, the stuff that we think should be on the billboards and in the arenas on Rolling Stone and should be getting widespread coverage, and the things that you should care about that go beyond Beyonce and Taylor Swift and whoever else is on the front burner these days. So that's a long way of saying that we cover albums by up and coming and sort of under the radar artists. That said, Arturo, who are you covering this week in the parallel universe?
Oh, I'm excited for this one. It is my pleasure to finally talk about one of my personal favorite bands of the last 10 years, the Gothenburg, Sweden Septet. That's a 7-piece band for those who don't know.
Not septic.
The Septet, known as GOAT. In fact, I like this band so much that I will use this podcast, starting with this episode's Parallel Universe segment, to hype them up as much as possible, not only for our loyal listeners, but for you, Chris, who I think will be one of their biggest fans, especially if you listen to their back catalog. Future Vault or Parallel Vault segments will feature previous albums by this band. This will be my way of getting you to listen to them.
Which is not going to be hard, but go ahead.
Yeah. Well, to keep things brief, they launched in 2012 with their critically acclaimed, brilliant debut album, World Music. In a time when indie rock and/or anything trying to pass itself as underground rock, quote unquote, started to become a euphemism for crappy retro 80s synth pop, Goat zagged where everyone else zigged. Theirs was an audacious blend of swirling, guitar-heavy psychedelic rock with 1970s Afrobeat rhythms and song structures. Imagine if Jimi Hendrix hadn't died and in 1972 managed to hook up with Fela Kuti and his legendary Africa 70 band. Yes, it's that awesome. They followed that modern classic up with 2014's Commune, which, while still a very good album, was pretty much a rehash of the alluring sound they conjured up on their first one. They underwent a much welcome change in musical direction in 2016 with their excellent third album, Requiem. The African influence was traded in for a distinct flavor of South American indigenous folk music that was heavy on acoustic textures. Think what the natives in the jungles of Colombia and the hills of Peru might be playing, but with a rock sensibility.
Oh, yeah.
After a 6-year hiatus, Goat have returned this year with another terrific album of hypnotic, trancey, psychedelic rock drenched in pan-global rhythms and international folk mystery by the name of Oh Death. Great name.
Yep.
The first half of the album offers a little bit of what Goat did on their previous 3 albums. Chukua Pesa takes psych folk to logical extremes with Middle Eastern textures. Somewhere the ghost of Brian Jones is smiling. Under No Nation is a funky, ass-shaking dance floor killer that wouldn't have been out of place in any nightclub in Lagos, Nigeria in the early 1970s. The rollicking bass line of Do the Dance and its accompanying crunching guitar riff is dying for a stadium to fill and sounds like the logical successor to the White Stripes' Seven Nation Army. The second half, though, is where Goat show their hand and where they're really headed musically. Blow the Horns shows a more decidedly jazzy influence than they've ever delved into before, not unlike some of the alluring 1970s Ethiopian jazz sounds of one of my favorites, Mulatu Astatke, before breaking down into a very, very un-Goat-like arena rock riff reminiscent of Kiss. Seriously.
Yeah.
The last third, Mulatu Astatke meets Kiss. You'll never hear that with any other band.
Yeah, go. Wow. Yeah,
the last third of the album, it's a suite that comprises Remind Yourself, Blessings, and Passes Like Clouds that finds Goat embracing a direction they always seem destined to travel. Krautrock. And now I hate saying that word, but just 1970s progressive German rock is basically what krautrock
basically.
is.
A lot of fuzz on this record.
Yeah.
It's good.
Yeah. Now, on this podcast, we've talked about how this is an unfortunate, if not offensive term to describe the groundbreaking, innovative prog rock that came out of Germany in the 1970s. However, since that term has become critical parlance at this point, I guess we can use it as well. In any case, the record ends on a mystifying, exotic streak of loose, seemingly unrelated sounds and textures that somehow coalesce into a beautiful whole and eerily evoke the mid-1970s experimentalism of bands such as Can and Faust. This is another great album by Goat, another great band, a fascinatingly great band, and further proof that Sub Pop Records, yes, Sub Pop, still alive and kicking and still based in Seattle, is still one of the best indie labels in the world.
Yeah, fabulous band. This is a fabulous guitar record.
Yeah.
Those guys can play, but they also can get that fuzz. And so it's kind of like underground California from like 1968, 69. That then gets blended, like you said, with Afrobeat and other world rhythms. I got to say, this is the only album I've heard, and this is fascinating, that has influence from both Nigeria and Tuareg.
Yeah.
And the Tuaregs, like the Mokhtar set. These days. And so there's a few guitar solos that are very reminiscent of the kind of stuff that Mdo Mokhtar has been coming up with in the last few years. So that's really, really impressive, especially for a bunch of Swedish guys that like wear like masquerade ball masks when they're performing. And so, I'm glad that you've turned me on to Goat, because this one is going to be on my top 10 records for the year. I've done a few repeat listens to this one, so they definitely come highly recommended. I think that anybody that is a fan of like weird bands, that sort of think of not just the jammy bands, but think of some of the experimental bands or some of the better. A lot of them come from Britain. A lot of them come actually from Germany. These days, you will definitely like this record. Any other thoughts before we move on?
Yeah, no. The continental Europe is putting out some great band. The Netherlands,
Yeah.
Sweden. For the next episode, my parallel universe segment will be a Dutch band. So continental Europe is kicking butt right now.
Oh yeah, no, absolutely. As is Philadelphia.
Yeah.
And so that's where we're going next. So this is officially a trend. I've been working on my top 10 for the year, which is something we're going to do here within the next couple episodes. Arturo and I will be sharing our top 10 albums of 2022 in an episode. So I've been working on that. 3 of the records that are going to end up on my top 10, Arturo hates. At least 3 that I know of. So there's 2 albums that I've covered here in the Parallel Universe over the last several months. One is the album from Black Midi, which I think is fascinating. It's one of those things. It's easier to appreciate than actually listen to. Although there's a few kick-ass songs on that. Just basically with them, think like Primus equals Captain Beefheart and sort of other pussy rock from the from the 1970s. And then you've got Anxious's Little Green House, which I covered last time, which is a bunch of kids from Connecticut that are doing the most competent and really enjoyable and deep emo, revival emo right now, I think, in America. And so Arturo hated both those records and made no bones about it on these episodes. Okay, so let's do it again. But my favorite album of this year, the most exciting record of this year, I don't know if it's necessarily going to end up number 1 on my list, but certainly the most exciting album I've heard this year. So it's this young band from Philadelphia named Soul Glow. In case you're wondering, yes, they are named after the most funny running joke in Coming to America. So great name, especially fitting since they are a black hardcore band. Metal band, hardcore band.
The drummer is white though.
Yeah, that's So basically multiracial, but it's led by a young man named Pierre Jordan, who was absolutely a fascinating character. And so, as hardcore is apt to do, a very screamy record, but really, really, really compelling, because I guess you can refer to this album as one of 2 labels. You can either call it personal nihilism or post-nihilism in terms of where Jordan is coming from. Again, exciting screamo record. I mean, there is some Bad Brains influence. I mean, if you're a black hardcore band, every black hardcore band has influence from Bad Brains, let's face it. But it's got a little bit more modernization than that. I think that there actually is some Run the Jewels DNA within it. And I think some just sort of more, I think that they're a throwback to the sort of the Austin screamo bands of a generation ago, and they just have a modern sensibility. And that Jordan is a fascinating kid in the sense that, yes, I mean, I guess you could say he's a radical, and that he wants to see it all burn down. African American experience, yes. I mean, he has struggled with mental illness. He talks about on one of the songs about once having a gun in his mouth. But also has, been there as far as the struggle, seeing the violence in the streets. Remember, we're 2 years removed from the George Floyd triggered protests here in the U.S. But here's the thing. He is sick of the American left and the, sort of what we know as the far left. And I think he sees them as ineffective and phony. and he goes to that extent on this record. Several of the songs go there, but there's also kind of a fabulous or a fascinating tension here, because he's he's protesting them, but he's also he's picking on and sort of saying that the conditions that we have, the reason that I've kind of given up and I'm kind of in this rage phase and kind of isolated from all that, is basically the fault of uppity white people. So, we have a contrast. There's a lyric from We Want's Revenge where he says, my one complaint about this record is he uses the N-word way too much. But he says, many minds can get through all 10 years of their 20s with no time, get a bullshit degree in a family, and trauma still beating them within an inch of their life. So kind of bags on them. But then from the song Gripnomics, which is really a hip hop song, everything kind of in this album is very much of the hardcore usual thing with the just sort of bash out guitars, and yet very, very screamy. Jordan's the best screamer in the world right now. I mean, it's just, lots of words, and it's very unhinged, but very compelling. But from Dripnotics, he also has a line where he says, elites don't fight fair, got no time to care. And so, yeah, it speaking of trickle down, it basically makes this joke in that song where, not just the economics that trickles down. It's, the reason that we're so fucked up down here is because of up there. So interesting stuff. I would say that the highlights on this record are, Jumper Get Jumped, which again is just sort of very sort of in the streets and paranoia and violence and uncertainty. This guy's very inert. Dripnomics, I said, it's just fabulous, which is essentially programmed drums and sound effects and rapping. And very much influenced, I think, by LP. I don't think that there's a doubt there. He's got a song called 5 Years in My Family, which, again, is fascinating in the sense of where it's got a great riff. And it's got, this guy doesn't have melodies. It's basically like screamed poetry over, these riffs. Great hooks, though. It's kind of a funny mix, because he'll, on the lyrics, it's... And then when they get to the choruses, it's like actually really good hooks. But anyway, 5 Years in My Family, basically it's a narrative of his last 5 years of both leaning on therapy and his parents. And so just kind of making the joke that, I spent all this money and time in therapy, but I ended up going to my mom. And that's what, that's what worked for me, and talks about his personal experience there. And then, as I already mentioned, We Want's Revenge, which has the best riff on the album. And, basically that's him rejecting the formal organized left, but also kind of hearkening back to 9/11 and how that kind of changed his mindset as a kid and his dad's mindset and those types of things. So again, very, very compelling. It's interesting because, Philadelphia, we think of like, the war on drugs and Kurt Weill and Steve Gunn, which is basically, kind of white stoner folky kind of stuff, or Tom Petty ish. But, here we go. The best hardcore band in America. Everybody wants to put that title on Turnstile, which was, in everybody's top 10 last year, which I didn't fucking get because I think that album's terrible. But this album, really exciting, 39 minutes of pure dynamite. And I encourage everybody to listen to Soul Glow. Diaspora Problems is the name of this record. Diaspora Problems, which is a good joke if you think about it. In this case, you're talking not just about sort of the mess or the disorganization of the left, but also sort of in Pierre Jordan's brain. So with that said, Arturo, tell us about how much you hate this record.
And the award for most atrocious vocal performance by any human being put on record this year goes to that dude from Soul Glow.
And that's where we differ, because I think it's the most fascinating. I think it's like the most amazing vocal that I've heard this year. You think it's atrocious, and why do you think it's atrocious?
Because it's nothing. It's just static. There's nothing to it. His lyrics really aren't that smart. It's just psychological vomit. Musically, listen, I get it. You know, they're into their time signatures. They like to play with time signatures. Every single song has shifting rhythms. It all starts one way, with like a really super super fast hardcore riff and rhythm. Then it goes through all these different shifts and then ends back in the way it started before with those, straight ahead, hardcore riff and rhythm. Okay, that's fine. It's cool that they're interested in time signatures the way they are. But I think the songwriting is really bad. And this kind of music, when you're talking about songwriting, you're talking about riffs and what you do with the riffs and how you link the riffs and how they segue into other passages of songs within the song, if you will. And there's nothing about this band that isn't derivative or just like of what's come before. Like honestly, Bad Brains went in this territory, exact same territory, 40 years before, with much better lyrics, with much more sophistication, with much better, in my opinion, much better musicality, and even a better frontman and a better vocalist and a better lyricist. Like I said, seriously, if you really want to listen to like this kind of post-hardcore stuff, I highly recommend an album that I recommended earlier this year by a British band called Bob Vylan. And if you talk about, being pissed off at uppity white folks, that's the band that does it better. And they do it more intelligently and they do it more soulfully. It's very telling that, in my opinion, the only good song on this Soul Glow record is the hip hop song, Dripponomics?
Dripnomics, yeah. Or Dripponomics,
yeah. Why is it the best song? Well, because it's not, hardcore punk vomit. It's actually a pretty cool, steady hip hop song. And guess what? The vocalist is barely on the track. They bring a woman in the studio to do the rapping over it. Guess what? Maybe the band should get rid of this guy and make her the full-time vocalist.
I don't know. Well, yeah, it's like it's a co-rapper. I would say that it's maybe something of a fair criticism in the sense that they do have those again. If Pierre Jordan is sort of rambling nihilistic poetry, the band does have those shifts, and in some respects, they don't flow quite as well as you would get from like an actual emo band. I mean, these guys aren't they're not really writing pop songs, which is why I kind of like them. That's what makes them a little bit exciting.
No, but even within the context of noisy rock, with noisy, like flat out non-melodic rock, this still is not very captivating. It doesn't have the assault to the senses that Mets have. They don't have the sophistication of like 40 years earlier, Bad Brains. They don't have the smarts and the sense of dynamics of Bob Vylan. They just lack what all those bands had that, in my opinion, make their band special.
And a couple of responses to that one. I think it's kind of unfair to sort of expect any sort of Bad Brains type quality. I mean, Bad Brains basically invented and pioneered the notion of an authentically black punk hardcore band.
Okay, good.
And they did. They went back and forth between screaming, and they had like really great melodies, and their stuff was exciting, but it was pioneering. And so I would say that any African American band that follows them, come on, even Living Colour had Bad Brains DNA. So that's
then in that case, can I at least get Bob Vylan quality?
But the one thing I'll say about Bob Vylan is they definitely in many parts of their record ate Dead Prez from 20 years ago. Basically, it's Dead Prez done by British guys, updated for the 2020s, and so
it's a grime hip hop influenced version of rap metal, very Dead Prez influence, but they're not regurgitating Dead Prez. They're assimilating them, so that's cool.
But then again, I don't know. I mean, they both had vegan anthems on it, so it's like, where did Bob Vylan?
Well, so does Morrissey.
I suppose.
Hey, folks, it's Chris. One of the things we've learned over the life of the Curmudgeon Rock Report is that if you want to build a better podcast, it's a really good idea to listen to other podcasts. It not only keeps us on our toes, but hey, there's a lot of fascinating information out there in podcast land, presented by lots of fascinating people. Here's one podcast that I've been vibing on lately. Cocaine and Rhinestones, The History of Country Music. Host Tyler Mahan Coe, the son of rebel songwriter David Allan Coe, spins really good yarns about the fables, legends, and characters that have dotted the country landscape since its very beginnings. This includes a few tales that are just so insane, yet you have to know that they're true. The main reason to listen to Cocaine and Rhinestones, however, is an intermittent series of episodes of the saga of George Jones and Tammy Wynette. Coe has a straightforward, deadpan narrative style that helps you appreciate just how wild these two country icons were. The more you listen, the more your jaw will drop over just how addiction overtook the mind of George Jones. So right after you're done listening to us, check out Cocaine and Rhinestones. It's available at all the places where you find all of the other podcasts.
All right. So in the last episode, which was part 1 of the first golden age of rock, we really went into the African-American pioneers of rock and roll. You know, Chuck Berry, Little Richard, Bo Diddley, Fats Domino, and a little bit of Ike Turner too, even. And in this second part, we're focusing on how that music, that rock and roll, which was originally basically rhythm and blues, but then it became a mutant strain of rhythm and blues once musicians and artists started injecting a country swing into the music. And it started to be called rock and roll here. But basically for this episode, we're going to start off on rock and roll hitting the mainstream. And when we're talking about hitting the mainstream, is really in the 1950s, it means crossing over to a white audience. And in this case, particularly white teenagers. And one of the earliest artists of the rock and roll era, slightly before Elvis, that really took on, before we get into what we call the four main white guys, slightly before Elvis started getting hits with a kind of a rock and rollish sound, we want to give a quick shout out to Bill Haley and his weird hair. No, kidding. Just Bill Haley and the Comets. Chris, what about him? And his hair.
Bill Haley is a Philadelphia guy. Started off doing country bands, morphed into what we know is as basically early rock and roll. I think he discovered some rhythm and blues during that. So it's basically like a country, like a pop sort of dance hall country band that incorporated a little bit of rhythm and blues. Just to push back, or just to kind of elaborate on something that you said. You said it was basically this was the culture figuring out a way to sell rock and roll to white teenagers. No, I would say more accurately, it was a way to appease white adults and to appease the major labels and the white radio stations. Because, back then, remember, fascinating bit of trivia, Ahmet Ertegun, the famous record executive A&R guy, and who, he supported Aretha Franklin. That's probably why, and pushed her. And that's probably what he's most renowned for. He came up with the term rhythm and blues.
Oh, is it him?
Yeah, as a respectful euphemism for black music. It was sort of a replacement term for race music. But
could it be that it was called rhythm and blues before? Corny white people were calling it race music, and it was Ertegun and say, "Hey guys, let's just call it what it really is, what they call it, rhythm and blues."
Yeah, I mean, it was just a better marketing tag. It was a more respectful and actually, tasteful way of selling it. And so, yeah, Bill Haley, he was doing his thing. Rock Around the Clock was recorded or was released in 1954, performed modestly, and then their management really pushed to get Bill Haley's stuff in movies, because there was kind of a genre that happened for a couple of years of sort of teen dancey albums and movies. and eventually became like in '56, like rock, rock, rock. I think is the name of an actual name of one of those teen rock and roll movies. But they were able to get the song in a movie called Blackboard Jungle in 1955, which kind of took off with that niche, sort of white teen audience. And lo and behold, Bill Haley and the Comets had a #1 hit. That is still one of the more popular rock and roll singles of all time. The other thing that Bill Haley and the Comets are known for is the song "Shake, Rattle, and Roll," which, to rehabilitate you a little bit, Arturo, was a cover of a Big Joe Turner song.
Okay.
And so, yes, Joe Turner's output was indeed whitenized, for widespread racist consumption back then. And so, that's really their legacy, is that they were basically a white band from the Northeast that was playing with a mixture of country and rhythm and blues, but way more country-ish. They weren't Chuck Berry, but they were the first one to break through and sort of pave the way. They were kind of like a precursor for the Elvis and the Memphis output, which we'll talk about in a little bit.
Absolutely. The second person we should give a quick shout out to, and he's not a musician or a singer, he's a DJ. And I briefly mentioned this guy in the last episode. He's the Cleveland-based DJ, well, was, because he died a while back, Alan Freed, who was, a white guy. But he actually, in the early 1950s on his radio show, he was very liberal in his airplay of blues and rhythm and blues music. He would actually have blues and rhythm and blues, black blues and rhythm and blues artists come into the studio and promote their records and interview them and play their music. And he may not have been the first person to coin the phrase rock and roll, which I still ascribe to the theory that rock and roll comes from, it's just a euphemism, Southern black slang for sex, back in the South.
I don't think there's any doubt about that. Yeah. No, not at all.
But Alan Freed was one of the first, if not the first, radio DJs to actually call the music rock and roll on the air and promoted it as rock and roll.
Yeah. So we're going to talk a little bit more about Alan Freed later in the episode. There's sort of two parts to his story, which are rise and fall. Basically, Freed was a white guy who grew up in Pennsylvania, was a musician himself, was a trombonist in swing bands.
Okay. All right.
Yeah, he was and really, swing. He always claimed that rock and roll was an outgrowth of swing, which in some ways is true. I mean, because swing was definitely influenced by boogie woogie, which we talked about last time. But anyway, he's a radio DJ. He's getting these jobs, and he lands. He's getting excited about black R&B and early rock and roll. He lands a job in 1950 or 51 with a Cleveland station, WJW. And he worked the overnight shift. And so he's working like midnight. And probably why he could get away with this, he was the one DJ. And back then, the white-owned radio stations basically said, you can't play black music. And so he kind of, in a way, said, the heck with that. And he was playing the original songs. So, for example, in the late 50s, a white band covered Earth Angel by the Penguins, and stuff like that, so basically all of these great, seminal black rock and roll songs had a white equivalent. We'll also talk a little bit about that more. It gets kind of funny, but he talked about, and he gave black artists a platform on commercial radio. By 1954, Freed had moved to New York, which is where he really had the big platform to break these bands, and where I think he had a lot of his most effect. And so that's his, he was the Hall of Fame. 1986 is the inaugural class. I don't want to name everybody on it, but basically everybody we've talked about in these episodes so far and will talk about, but Freed was in that original class. And as far as I know, was the only non-musician in that class. And the Hall of Fame in their sort of promotional, or their descriptor in his induction, calls him the greatest proselytizer of rock and roll in history. and that is his role. I mean, he was the proselytizer. He had a platform on mainstream radio and mainstream TV in the early days, and kind of gave rock and roll, excited the white teenagers by introducing them to the black music. And so, yeah, more power to him. But we'll talk more about that. The fascinating stuff with Freed comes when he gets to New York in the second half. So there you go.
Yeah. Speaking of, white music lovers who love their African-American music, Sam Phillips, the impresario for the Memphis, Tennessee-based indie label Sun Records. Sun Records will factor very much into the first person we'll spotlight on, give the heavy spotlight in this segment. But yes, Sam Phillips, Sun Records, those two names are synonymous and forever joined at the hip. Chris?
Yeah, absolutely. So, Sam Phillips, he is an engineer and a musician and a DJ, and a producer, an engineer. Opened up a little Sun studio in Memphis there, and I don't think it was necessarily on Beale Street, but it was there in sort of the main area of Memphis. And basically what it was is, people walked in and said, hey, we want to record a record. Or Phillips was like, hey, I like you, come in and record my stuff. And so a lot of demos and stuff like that. And so Phillips, by having a presence there, attracted eventually a few upstarts that you may have heard of: Elvis Presley, Jerry Lee Lewis, Johnny Cash, Carl Perkins. I mean, the $1 Million Quartet guys. But there were others that he worked with as well, sort of a little bit before there. But he
Howlin' Wolf actually recorded there for a little bit.
Yeah, which again, so Sam Phillips. I mean, he was an enthusiast of black music who had a few bucks, and like literally put in a way station, or basically like a train station for would be rock and rollers. Got to start in Muscle Shoals. So yeah, there you go. Muscle Shoals and Memphis. And Phillips was like the forerunner of both. Yeah, I would say that guy was influential to the formation and the formative stage of rock and roll.
Yeah. All right. Now, speaking of formative rock and roll, I guess if we're going to talk about anyone or someone, when you talk about 1950s rock and roll, you got to tackle the big pink elephant in the room, and that is none other than Elvis Presley.
Yeah, I mean, it figures that it's a pink elephant,
Yeah, because he was famous for wearing pink outfits in the 50s. When you talk about the streamlining of rock and roll into pop cultural American consciousness, and in the 1950s, this meant appealing to white people, and as I said, more importantly, young white people. Not one single solitary figure looms larger than Elvis. One can make the argument that he's the only white 1950s rock and roller worth talking about. And he can have an entire episode devoted just to him and what he did for the genre. The breadth of the man's story, his rise even more, his rise even higher, and his eventual fall into prescription pill oblivion and egocentric excess is almost mythic in its scope and, quite frankly, Shakespearean in its tragedy.
Yeah. Which means he went even higher.
Yeah.
Pardon me.
However, that would be shortchanging the other great artists we'll mention later in this episode. And besides, it's the curmudgeonly way to be as thorough as possible, as you all know. Anyway, sure. Before RCA Records unleashed Elvis onto the mainstream record-buying public in 1956, Chuck Berry, Little Richard, and Fats Domino had already scored major hits on both the R&B and pop charts. But when Elvis put his southern white hillbilly stamp on an originally African-American sound and style, rock and roll exploded with a ferocity of popularity never before seen with any genre of music ever. Within a 2-year period from the beginning of 1956 through the end of 1957, he scored more number one hit singles than any artist in American music history. Granted, the post-World War II media climate of television, radio, and overall mass media saturation aided in this explosion. But make no mistake that Elvis was at the very center of this hurricane, practically casting all other rock and roll artists, both white and black, as peripheral planets orbiting his bright, shining pink sun. Heartbreak Hotel, Blue Suede Shoes, Don't Be Cruel, Hound Dog, Love Me Tender, All Shook Up, Jailhouse Rock. You should know all these song titles, and if you don't, you'll definitely know the songs when you hear them. They are an indispensable part of the overall canon of rock and roll. Now, it's hard now for people with so many outlets and options for media consumption to distract themselves from mainstream entertainment to understand the ubiquity of Elvis's presence, his star wattage, and all-consuming charisma. I mean, you hear baby boomers talk about the Beatles and Beatlemania in the 1960s. Gen Xers love to extol beautiful nostalgia about Michael Jackson mania in the 1980s. The late 80s, early 1990s saw Madonna be that all-encompassing pop cultural musical colossus. Elvis in the 1950s was not only the equivalent of that, but the originator of such a phenomenon. His record company, RCA, deserves a big chunk of the credit for the public relations steamroller that was the Elvis Presley machine. But even more credit should go to his notorious manager, the Dutch immigrant Colonel Tom Parker, for whom Elvis was his only client. Now, talk about a story. That dude deserves a podcast all to himself.
Oh yeah, yeah. Parker. I mean, that's one of the great what could have been, or what might have been scenarios in rock and roll history. Like, what if Tom Parker hadn't said, you should be out doing movies and singing ballads with like Anne Margaret.
Yeah, exactly. But we'll have to make do with the surprisingly good Baz Luhrmann biopic film from earlier this year, Elvis, that tells Elvis's story through the eyes of Colonel Parker.
Yeah, yeah. Go ahead, sir.
It's played by Tom Hanks.
Yeah.
And he puts in a great performance, by the way, as the Colonel. I mentioned the epic, almost cinematic narrative of Elvis's life. Frankly, only the Beatles match the Elvis story for sheer drama. Here's the abridged version. He was born in 1935 in Tupelo, Mississippi as an only child. His twin brother died at birth. He was born to a pretty poor southern white couple named Vernon and Gladys. Vernon, being an unambitious and odd job working sort, was sentenced to prison for 8 months when Elvis was 3 years old due to forging checks. Gladys and their son, moved in with her family until Vernon got out, and the three of them moved into a low-income housing neighborhood quite close to the black part of town. Now, always having been admittedly a loner in school, it was quite common for little Elvis to hang out with the local black kids and even go to tent revival shows where he would watch and absorb swinging, highly musical gospel music performances that really seeped into his subconscious and would have a big influence on his performance style. The family moved to Memphis in 1948, and eventually a teenaged Elvis, who by now played a little guitar and sang at his mother's church gatherings, became entranced with the Beale Street scene in the heart of town. Beale Street, we mentioned it earlier, for those who don't know, still exists and is famous for its plethora of blues and rhythm and blues bars and clubs. As mentioned earlier, unlike most of his white peers at the time, Elvis was comfortable hanging out with black people. What some with modern sensibilities may call appropriation, in defense of Elvis, I'll call it assimilation. He absorbed and soaked up black American music the same way he absorbed gospel from the church and country music from his relatives. He sure wasn't the first one to think of such a mixture of styles, but he was too young and naive to know otherwise. Besides, what eventually came out was indeed his own unique spin on that whole mix. Throw in that rich baritone voice and smoldering sexuality, which he was very much aware of and in his early days sold it to the hilt, and you had a powder keg ready to blow. The man was sex on a stick back then. He really was. At the age of 18 in 1953, fresh out of high school, Elvis walked into Sam Phillips' Sun record studio and paid to record himself singing, just so he can hear what he sounded like.
Yeah, can you imagine? He actually walked in and said, "Hey, man, I want to cut a demo."
Yeah. Mama, I want to record myself singing. Yeah. Phillips and his assistant liked his ability as a ballad singer and kept his name on file. In early 1954, when he was working as a truck driver, he cut an acetate recording of a couple of ballads. Nothing came of it. He later auditioned for a vocal harmony group. He failed the audition because he reportedly lacked an ear for harmony. Nevertheless, even if he couldn't really pinpoint it, Sam Phillips thought he heard something in young Elvis. In the summer of that year, Phillips asked Elvis to come in and whip up some songs with guitarist Scotty Moore and bassist Bill Black to record them. What Elvis whipped up was Arthur Crudup's 1946 blues number, That's All Right. Or That's All Right, Mama. As soon as Phillips, who loved African-American music and was keen to sell it to a broader audience, if he could find a white face to sell it to, when he heard it, he was smitten. Recorded right there in the Sun Records studio and released on the Sun Records label, That's All Right, with its slap bass echo and its really minimalist production, really gritty and raw for its time. Especially for white radio. That's All Right was an overnight smash hit throughout Tennessee and various major markets in the South. All of a sudden, Chuck Berry was not the only one merging rhythm and blues with country, and rock and roll had a white face. It was also the birth of rockabilly. From the end of 1954 through 1955, Elvis became a Southern regional sensation, selling out country fairs and any clubs and bars that would have them. Women throwing their panties onto the stage was an act usually reserved for blues and R&B audiences, i.e. black women. Now, white women, and in particular, teenage white girls, were doing it. Oh, no.
And Elvis probably had sex with half of them.
Probably. Not only was a new kind of music out there for young white people, but a new kind of sex symbol as well. Curled lip, gyrating hips, quivering crotch, slicked up black hair, dreamy eyes, up-tempo R&B with a country swing. Like I said earlier, sex on a stick. Bob Neal, a Memphis radio DJ and concert promoter, became his manager in early 55. By the middle of that year, that management team became a partnership with Colonel Tom Parker, previously a promoter and manager of country singers such as Eddie Arnold and Hank Snow. By the fall of 55, Parker had edged out Neal and became Elvis's sole manager, and then he helped Elvis land a major label deal with RCA, and the rest was history. Chris?
Yes, it was. It was definitely history. Yeah, Elvis. So, Public Enemy's Chuck D had it wrong. One of the most famous lyrics in hip hop history is from the song "Fight the Power." Elvis was a hero to most, but he never meant shit to me. Sucker was straight out racist, simple and plain. Motherfuck him and John Wayne.
Well, John Wayne was racist.
Well, yeah, we know that, but really unfair because you mentioned, I think, one of the more important and underplayed stories of the Elvis bio and the Elvis mythos is that he was born and grew up in Tupelo, Mississippi in the 1940s.
Yeah.
And so, which was a really good place to be if you were any sort of, were listening to the blues and the I guess eventually the rhythm and blues that were there, close to the Mississippi River in that area. And we talked about it last episode that there was that great migration from Mississippi to Chicago, which is how, like Bo Diddley gets up there and a few others, Muddy Waters among them. And so Elvis was right there to, at the vanguard of black music that eventually became rock and roll. And he is one of the great translators. He was a megaphone. like some of his most famous songs. And you also mentioned rockabilly. I mean, Scotty Moore is one of the greatest guitarists of all time. And so, Elvis had this blues sense, but he had this country sense. And so he could take old boogie woogie and blues songs and other songs there, and he could put a rockabilly spin on them. There was a boogie woogie slash band leader type named Roy Brown, who was active in the mid 40s. He had a song called Good Rocking Tonight, which was covered by a few people, but Roy Brown's version is very horn laden, very, I guess you could say Count Basie influenced. And the rocking there, both, I think, is a double entendre for both dancing and screwing. And so, but it's very much horn. It's very much almost like a Fats type of song.
Yeah.
But Elvis takes that and rockabilly's it, and captures the soul and the spirit of it, but through the Scotty Moore, acoustic and that sort of kind of galloping drum thing that you get in a lot of the early Elvis songs. So great translator of black music. And the other thing about Elvis, and we'll get into this a little bit later, is actually he was one of the triggers of all things of the sort of the pushback on rock and this white corporate effort to tamp it down and try to kill it. The guy was too good looking to be on TV shaking his hips. And and so famously in '56 he appeared on the Ed Sullivan Show, and they refused to put anything from the waist down on camera. And so there was a rock and roll. Yes. I mean, a lot of the early stuff was euphemisms and not so subtle euphemisms. Well, either euphemisms or not so subtle odes to sex. A lot of it was, sort of, 60-Minute Man, which basically might be the greatest tribute to anorgasmia of all time, and all of that. But Elvis, he not only, some of the songs he did, yes, were euphemisms for sex, but he put like sex appeal. I mean, Chuck Berry, I mean,
it wasn't a 65-year-old fat blues guy from Mississippi singing about sex.
No, not at all. And, Chuck Berry was handsome in his own right, but, take like Bo Diddley. No. But, so Elvis put this, this face on it. And also the greatest hair dye job in the history of the world.
Elvis was a brunette. He was a brown-haired dude.
Yeah, it was like Sandy. It was like Sandy Brown or something like that. It wasn't blonde, but it was like Sandy Brown. And he puts the black dye in, wears the pomade, and there you go. There's the Elvis.
Mama.
Yep, that we all know and love. And he, like you said, he had a 2-year streak where he's the one, and I'm glad it was him. Because I'm sure that corporate execs by that point were catching on to Little Richard and Chuck Berry, and not only that, but the fact that white teenagers were really catching on to this, and we'll get into more of that later. And so I think they were looking for a white face to make money off of rock and roll, and boy did Elvis give it to them in spades.
Yes, he did,
for sure. And so lots of legacy. Obviously, we could spend like 5 episodes talking about Elvis, but one of the great what ifs. Probably the single greatest rock and roll singer of all time. That guy could sing anything.
I don't know. Freddie Mercury would have something to say about that, but I don't know.
I understand. Yeah, well, Mercury is, as far as classically trained singers. But anyway, I digress. Next.
Anyway, all right. Next spotlight for mainstream white rock and roll. When it comes to white rock and rollers from the South in the 1950s, Jerry Lee Lewis was very much the yang to Elvis Presley's yin, or the yin to his yang, whatever. Despite his portrayal by the media at the time as a rock and roll wild child, Elvis was actually quite a nice boy. He loved his mama. He believed in God. He was known to be exceedingly polite and well-mannered. He was much more humble than people gave him credit for. During his peak years, he didn't drink or do drugs. Of course, that would change when he started taking amphetamine pills in the military, which led to his spiraling prescription pill addiction. But that's another story. Lewis, however, was the real wild man of rock.
Oh, yeah.
While he was a devout Christian, he also drank like a fish, loved to play with guns, was brash and arrogant, thought he was the best and made sure people heard it from him, was a shameless womanizer, and at his drunken worst was belligerent as hell. Today's woke culture could not tolerate someone like Jerry Lee Lewis.
Probably not. No.
But hey, that was rock and roll back then. Musically, Lewis was the white answer to Little Richard, an astonishing piano player with a great voice and an outrageous kinetic live act that included setting the piano on fire while he played it. Now, where the hell did this fucking firebrand come from? He was born in 1935, the same year as Elvis, and grew up in Faraday, Louisiana, to a poor family that mortgaged their farm in order to buy him a piano. Yes, he was precociously talented at a young age and grew up exposed to blues and boogie-woogie music from the black juke joints in town. A lot of people with modern sensibilities would be surprised to know how close in proximity poor white and poor black people lived in the South at that time. That's a very, very understated reason for the ethnic crossover of rock and roll. We just talked about two people here, Elvis and Jerry Lee, two poor white kids who grew up surrounded by black kids. There you go. In any case, Lewis's parents probably didn't like his inclination toward black music because as a teenager, he was forced to enroll in the Southwest Bible Institute in Waxahachie, Texas, so he could exclusively play evangelical Christian music. Well, that didn't work because
he was there for only there for like 3 weeks, right?
I know. Almost immediately, Lewis pissed off the faithful by performing a boogie woogie versions of Christian songs at church assemblies. It's hilarious. He just loved to piss people off. He was expelled, went back to his hometown, and embarked on a music career playing clubs and bars all around Louisiana and Mississippi. Whether it was as a solo act or as part of a band, Lewis cut his teeth and his chops during this time in his life, the early 1950s, which coincided with R&B morphing into rock and roll. And young Jerry Lee was right in the thick of it, learning from many of the black pioneers. In late 1956, he decided to strike out on his own and went up to Memphis to audition for Sun Records. Sun owner Sam Phillips took a liking to Lewis, especially to his piano playing, as Lewis soon became a hotshot session musician, playing on tracks for Carl Perkins and Johnny Cash. The year 1957 was the year that Lewis would explode onto the national consciousness, however, with two scorching, red-hot rocking songs that would go on to become all-time classic rock and roll standards. Whole lot of shaking going on, and Great Balls of Fire had the distinction of going to number one on both the R&B and country charts. Talk about crossing over.
Yeah, no shit.
With the former song hitting number 3 on the pop singles chart and the latter going to number 2. The next year, Breathless would reach number 7. Lewis was starting to rival Elvis for rock and roll supremacy until in 1958 it emerged that Lewis's third wife, yes, by the age of 23, he was already working on his third wife. His third wife was actually his 14-year-old cousin. The scandal pretty much killed his career. He went back to working the club circuit both in the U.S. and abroad until he rejuvenated his career and reinvented himself as a country artist, having several hits on the country chart from the late 1960s through the early 1970s. Reportedly, though, Lewis never stopped playing wild rock and roll at his concerts during this or any other time. And honestly, it's wild rock and roll that Jerry Lee Lewis should always be remembered for. That and his wild fucking lifestyle. Chris?
Oh, yeah. You remember the movie Close Encounters of the Third Kind, right?
Yes.
Yeah, I swear that Steven Spielberg should have cast Jerry Lee Lewis to play the alien that comes off the ship. I mean, the guy was not really of this of this world. He's like one of the single, like most eccentric and just sort of unusual and fascinating characters in rock and roll. I mean, a couple of funny stories. There's interviews with him on YouTube, and he's funny. He makes no bones about it. He's like the cockiest guy in the world. And he talks about like sort of his early travels. He talks about that Southwest Bible College thing where he does boogie woogie versions of the gospel songs just to piss everybody off, which is hilarious. But two other things that he talks about. I guess he auditioned for Slim Whitman's band. Of all people, Slim Whitman, kind of yodeling Western swing. Yeah, didn't pass the audition. A few years later, Lewis brags that Whitman opened for him. So there's that. Just the picture of Jerry Lee Lewis auditioning for Slim Whitman is hilarious. And then he moved to Nashville for a little while, and I don't know if he ended up staying there, but he's in Nashville and he's trying to get work as a session musician. And one of the stations or one of the studios was like, "We want you to play guitar," and he's like, "Man, I'm a piano player. Are you kidding?" And he held out and he said, piano was what I do, and marvelously so. I mean, you see the old videos of it playing piano and then kicking the bench out from underneath him and, the leg up on the piano and, all this other stuff, clearly like probably cocked out of his mind. Or whatever.
It wasn't just booze. He was on cocaine too, wasn't he?
Yeah, probably. Well, yeah. I mean, if you in the dictionary under cocaine, besides Henry Hill and Goodfellas, you probably see him. And so it was a performance and a show all onto itself. I mean, brilliant musician and piano player. It's worth mentioning again, and we covered this a year and a half ago. We did an episode of this podcast on live albums. Live at the Star Club in Hamburg is probably one of the three greatest live records of all time.
It's my number one.
Yeah, and it's up there for me now too. And I've been, we did that episode. I had heard it, but I've listened to it in rotation now. It is extraordinary.
Yeah,
and it just kind of gives you the idea of the energy that guy was capable of. That guy was just a pure exploding rock and roll. I mean, it wasn't like the lights in the shoes. It was more like dynamite in the shoes. Every step he took, the guy was pure explosive rock and roll.
And that band he was playing with on that record, on that live album, it's a pickup band, the local German pickup band. He just met him that day. All right.
No, actually,
really?
The real
Are you sure?
Yeah, no, the real story is that they were a backing band of like the Nashville. I can't exactly remember, but they were like the Nashville Tunes. And so they had a residency in Hamburg, right?
Okay.
And so, they backed him while he was in Europe, but they were their own standalone band. And what happened is that Lewis shows up unannounced. I mean, they didn't know he was going to be there. And he comes up on stage and just goes into this just wild show where, he's doing covers of other, he does a cover of Long Tall Sally. And I think he does Good Golly Miss Molly too, but they could barely keep up with him. Like literally in a couple of songs, they don't keep up with him. And so it's extraordinary to listen to, but he's absolutely influential. And, the speed, and Little Richard ended up getting there too, but I think the speed of how he played and the ferocity. I think that is his main gift to the formation of rock and roll. Nobody did it as crazily as that guy. Singular talent. Crazy man though.
Yeah, was. Yeah, and over in England, young Reginald Dwight was listening.
That is correct.
For those who don't know, Reginald Dwight is Elton John.
Yep.
But anyway, okay. The next spotlight for our second episode of these early rock and roll legends, Buddy Holly. Of all the early rock and rollers, the only one who really approached Chuck Berry as a songwriter and composer, purely songwriter and composer, was Buddy Holly.
Yeah.
He had a gift for beautiful melody, a penchant for narrative storytelling in his lyrics, like Chuck Berry, and he was a very underrated guitar player. Another parallel one could draw between Holly and Berry is country music. Whereas Berry wasn't afraid to inject country music swing, song structure, and lyrical stories into his own visionary brand of rock and roll, Holly started his career out as a legitimate country artist, heavily influenced by Hank Williams, Jimmy Rogers, Bill Monroe, the Carter family, that whole ilk. He was born in Lubbock, Texas in 1936, and he was on his way to a career in country music until he saw Elvis Presley perform in his hometown during one of Elvis's many Southern tours in 1955. Holly was so gobsmacked by the full force gale of Elvis as a performer and by rock and roll in general that he made an immediate career about face. Late that year, while opening for Bill Haley and the Comets, a music scout from Nashville was impressed with what he saw and convinced Jim Denny, manager of the Grand Ole Opry radio show, to take Holly on as a client and get him a recording contract. That he did, and Holly signed with Decca Records in early 1956. He recorded and released several fine rock and roll singles throughout that year, but unfortunately wasn't able to score a hit. Holly wasn't happy with the lack of freedom Decca afforded him, nor with how they promoted his music. So in early 1957, Holly and his band went out to New Mexico to the studio of Norman Petty, who had produced and promoted some of Holly's favorite singles at that time. Petty agreed to be Holly's new manager, and he oversaw Holly and his band record That'll Be the Day. To try their luck with a different record label, Holly and his team sent the record to New York City's Brunswick Records, which was a subsidiary of Decca. Since Holly was still contractually bound directly to Decca, the song could not be released under his name, so it was released by Brunswick under his band's name, The Crickets. Holly and Decca made an arrangement eventually where his songs on the Brunswick imprint would be under the name The Crickets, and his songs on another Decca subsidiary, Coral Records, though those would be released under his own name. But make no mistake about it, though, it was all Buddy Holly. The irresistible swinging charm of That'll Be the Day became an international smash hit in 1957, reaching number one on both the US and UK pop singles charts. Later that same year, Peggy Sue, quite possibly his most famous song with that driving drum rhythm and gnarly guitar solo that practically invented surf rock, hit number 3 in the pop chart, and the jubilant wonder of Oh Boy went to number 10. In early 1959, Holly was one of the most popular and respected rock and roll figures on the scene when his life was tragically cut short in a plane crash in Clear Lake, Iowa, that also took the lives of rock and rollers Ritchie Valens and the Big Bopper. We'll mention them a little bit later. Tragically is the operative word because at the age of 22, Buddy Holly was just starting to spread his wings as a songwriter and as an artist. Bob Dylan, Mick Jagger, Keith Richards, Eric Clapton, Elton John, all have admitted how influential and important Holly was to them. Both John Lennon and Paul McCartney contended that they were inspired to name their band the Beatles because Holly named his band the Crickets after an insect. It's tantalizing to think what he would have done had he lived on. Chris?
Sure. A couple of legacies of Holly. Got to remember, he grew up in Lubbock, Texas, which is northwest Texas. South of there, in the Permian Basin, Ernest Tubb and was doing his thing, Texas Troubadour. In the Panhandle, Bob Wills, who's basically the inventor of Western swing, he grew up in the Panhandle, which is North Texas. Eventually settled in Fort Worth, but had the influence. So I think being in West Texas and just having that country songwriting influence, because especially Bob Wills was a great songwriter. He's known as a fiddler, but he was an amazing songwriter. And so I don't think that there's any doubt that those two and probably Chuck Berry had a huge influence on Holly's style. One of the more lyrical in terms of his, not Bob Dylan lyrical, but in terms of his sort of soul, like a lyrical soul performers of all time, the earnesty with which he sang, the earnesty of his lyrics. There really wasn't an anger there. There was a sweetness and a confidence to him. Interesting things in the course of this research. I saw a couple research for this episode. I saw a couple of places say that he's the one that kind of popularized the two guitars, bass, drum setup. that
Oh,
we
wow.
know. Well, that rock and roll. I mean, before that, it was all trios.
Yeah, yeah.
Like most of these folks that we've talked to, uh, Johnny Cash had a famous trio. Elvis Presley had a famous trio. Chuck Berry was trio.
Yeah.
And I think Bo Diddley was trio as well. And so here he comes and he's a 4-piece. And so I think
Mm.
that's a definite influence too. Yeah, that plane crash, which gave us Don McLean's American Pie. One of the depending on your perspectives, fortunate or unfortunate outgrowths of that plane crash. The plane crash, I mean, that's a real tragedy because it wasn't just him. It was Richie Valens, who was a tremendous singer and artist in his own right, and then the Big Bopper, who was like one of the great characters in the history of rock and roll, J.D. Richardson. The funny, well, not funny, but true story about that was that Waylon Jennings was supposed to be on that plane, but Bopper said, because Bopper was a big guy, he said, if I go on that bus, my back is gonna hurt, so I need to be on the plane. So yeah, Waylon got out of that alive. Waylon got his start really, and as being a member of Holly's band. So that's where Holly comes in. He was in the right locale and had those right influences, and sort of took that kind of countryish lilt and applied that gift for really beautiful verse chorus verse flow. His stuff just flowed too. I mean, it just had even Peggy Sue is like that, but That'll Be the Day. He's got the most famous cover. Well, second most famous cover, if not Fade Away, which is kind of perfect for him. I say second famous because go figure who's we all know who the most famous is.
The Stones. The Stones and then the Dead. Yeah.
Yeah, well, the Dead, Mickey Hart, God bless him in the 80s. So anyway, Holly, huge influence and probably one of the great what could have beens in the history of rock. I mean, he's right there with Hendrix and Kurt Cobain and a few others that died way too young.
Yeah.
And so, very, very influential character. And also, Elvis Costello was like, oh man, I want those glasses too.
Totally ripped off his look from music, the punk rock Buddy Holly.
Yep.
All right. Now, the final mainstream white rock and roll artist we're going to focus on here, the Everly Brothers. Now, quite possibly the most underrated and most overlooked of the early rock and roll legends of the 1950s are the Everly Brothers. They didn't rock with reckless abandon like Little Richard or Jerry Lee Lewis. They didn't swing or consistently write rock and roll classics like Chuck Berry. They didn't have the attitude or the primal power of Bo Diddley. They didn't have Elvis Presley's looks or magnetic presence or charisma. What they had, though, were those lovely, creamy vocal harmonies that gave their softer brand of rock and roll a warmth and a sense of emotional yearning that none of their peers were capable of. They mostly interpreted other people's songs, but when they did, they usually made them their own and sang them with really a beauty few could match. When they did write songs, they wrote some of the great all-time classics in rock and roll. Don and Phil Everly came from a pretty nomadic family. Don was born in Kentucky, while Phil was born in Chicago. They spent their early childhood in Iowa before the family moved to Knoxville, Tennessee, for the brothers' teenage years. Music was always the goal for the brothers as they went straight into a music career after graduating high school by getting spots in regional radio and TV variety programs in the Tennessee area. Chet Atkins, the legendary country music guitarist who by this time was managing RCA Records' recording studio in Nashville, was impressed with the teenaged Everlys and convinced them to go out to Nashville. He got them a small record deal with Columbia Records in early 1956, but after that one single flopped, Columbia soon dropped them. Atkins must have really loved the Everly Brothers because he helped them get a publishing deal with the Acuff Rose Music Publishing Company. Acuff Rose, in turn, helped the Everlys secure a deal with Cadence Records, a New York City independent label with major label distribution. The song Bye Bye Love, written by the husband and wife team of Felice and Boudleaux Bryant, was rejected by 30 artists before the Everlys recorded a beautifully lilting, wistful, almost skiffle version with one of the best acoustic guitar intros of all time. Released in 1957, the song rocketed to number 2 on the Billboard pop chart, and the Everlys were stars. They hit number 1 later that year with their most well-known song, Wake Up Little Susie, another Felice and Boudleaux Bryant song, essentially a country song souped up as acoustic rock and roll that tells a story of a teenage couple that falls asleep in a movie theater and wake up past the girls' curfew, leading to them worrying about their reputation at school and with their families. Oh no. In 1958, they hit number 1 again with the gorgeous ballad All I Have to Do Is Dream, written this time by Boudleaux Bryant solo. They really like this guy. One of the most truly beautiful songs of the early rock and roll era. Bryant would pen another monster hit for the brothers with Bird Dog, hitting number 2 on the Billboard pop chart during that same year. In the Everlys' hands, Bird Dog is probably the most rock and roll of the group's early hits, with its 12-bar blues in the verse and 8-bar blues in the chorus. However, it's arguably the Everly Brothers' greatest song that was written by Don Everly himself. Yeah. Kathy's Clown from 1960 was a massive hit that reached number 1 on both sides of the Atlantic with its innovative drum sound recorded with a tape loop to make it sound like there are 2 drummers, and its groovy, soulful chorus section that predates the Motown sound by a few years. The Everly Brothers hit their absolute peak as artists. The brothers would continue recording and touring throughout the mid-1970s, break up, and have a brief reunion in the 1980s. However, their halcyon period in the late 50s through the early 60s not only produced a string of timeless hits, but they also produced an understatedly innovative sound. One could argue they were early pioneers of country rock. In fact, they bravely went further into country music, more so than Chuck Berry ever did, and provided a blueprint for future country rock masters, the Byrds. But it was their voices that will probably be the one aspect of their musical legacy that will always endure. Older brother Don sang the baritone part, younger brother Phil sang the tenor harmony, and together their voices were a lush, soulful concoction that lent intimacy and depth to anything they sang. They essentially introduced the idea of close harmony vocals to rock and roll and paved the way for bands and artists such as the Beatles, the Beach Boys, and Simon and Garfunkel, and how they would approach vocal arrangements. The Everly Brothers are legends, and they should be remembered as such. Chris?
Phil Spector obviously was listening because he kind of cribbed the 2-part harmony for a lot of his stuff. Think the Righteous Brothers. The 2-part harmony is an influence. I think that sort of lilting country rock, but also just the melody. They just had a gift for that sort of just beautiful, not sentimental, but just really depth of feeling in how they did that. And even, like you said, Don Everly with Kathy's Clown, and then some of the rock, the more kind of sort of country or almost narrative songs he did in the early 60s. And, sort of they had some rockabilly to them as well. They were extraordinary. I mean, obviously the Byrds are influenced. Bob Dylan, you can kind of say maybe had some influence, but they, a lot of that stuff, I mean, notice how like 1964, most of the well-known rock songs are basically like Everly Brothers melodies. So I mean that's sort of their influence. We're including them on this only because again, they were nomadic, but they also had a regional sense. You want to hear a great album? 1958, they released an album called "Songs Our Daddy Taught Us." Which is them doing Western swing songs and pop songs. There was like pop songs or crooner songs from the 30s and 40s and this types of thing. Beautiful record, and it just kind of showed the influence and that they were kind of doing a sort of a modern forklift of those types of things. I mean, they weren't Western swing, but there was definitely an influence there. Maybe like rhythm and blues melody was a thing for them. But yeah, no, they the more interesting Everly Brothers stuff is from after 1960, like 61, 62, 63, where it gets a little weird. And I think at that point were not making hits, so they kind of got a little bit more experimental with how their arrangements and a little bit more adventurous with that. But no, without them, they were a rock band technically, but they were sort of the I guess if there's a white lineage to the formation of rock and roll, the Everly Brothers are an embodiment of it.
Right.
Which, then got, was an influence on a lot of other folks, like even on the black side.
Yeah.
I would say, some of the stuff, early Detroit stuff. I mean, it was kind of, and sure, Berry Gordy was kind of his take on Phil Spector, but also some of those songs like, Smokey Robinson. I mean, come on, some of his songs are like Everly Brothers influence. It's like Everly Brothers for black people, in some respects. So totally influential. And I mean, Don Everly was kind of the resident genius of the band, and he's the one. Because Phil, I guess, was the better natural singer, but Don was the one that put himself underneath and really made that stand out. And again, Simon and Garfunkel, as you said, were probably the best users of that formula, other than them, of all time. So there you go.
Yeah. On this episode, Chris and I concluded our two-parter on the first golden age of rock, the mid to late 1950s period when raw, primal rock and roll hit the mainstream music scene for the first time. For the next episode, we will fast forward 50 years into the future to the last time that raw, primal rock and roll was part of the mainstream music scene. Yes, I'm talking about none other than the White Stripes, the band that practically saved rock music in the noughties from the quagmire of both repugnant macho rap metal and wimpy indie rock. We'll discuss the band's trajectory from their beginnings in the Detroit suburbs to their rise to international fame with their brand of scuzzy garage rock blues punk, up to their breakup in 2008. We'll also do a deep dive into their discography of one classic album after another as we try to answer the question, were they truly the last great American band? Tune in next time as the Curmudgeon Rock Report presents The White Stripes, a Legacy. All right, now it's time for the lightning round of other great rock and roll artists and singers who maybe weren't as titanic in their importance and influence as the names that we talked about earlier, but they all had their moments and they all had their songs. And the first person we'll talk about here very quickly, Carl Perkins. Elvis, Presley, and Jerry Lee Lewis are part of that whole early mid-50s Memphis Sun Records crew, but so was Carl Perkins. And Carl Perkins is known mainly as a rockabilly guy. And he's most famous really for writing and performing for the first time Blue Suede Shoes. He had a hit with it. Elvis would have an even much bigger hit, right?
Mm-hmm. Yep. Oh, much bigger, yeah. But it was Perkins' song, though.
Yeah. And Perkins also wrote Everybody's Trying to Be My Baby, a song the Beatles covered on their 1965 album, Help. How about that? Let's see. Another one, The Big Bopper. Chris, what was the Big Bopper's big hit?
Chantilly Lace.
Yeah, that was one. Gene Vincent. Gene Vincent's an interesting one because he was known primarily as a rockabilly dude. But the thing with Gene Vincent, he was kind of a wild man of rock and roll as well, kind of like on the same level as Jerry Lee Lewis. In the 1960s, he would become an acid casualty.
Nice.
But he had some great songs. Jack White is an avowed Gene Vincent fan.
Oh,
Jack White, Gene Vincent's, you can hear in the vocals. He vocally, If
Yeah.
you hear early White Stripes, you can hear a big influence of Gene Vincent. Bebop-A-Lula was his biggest hit. He also had a couple of other great ones, Blue Jean Bop. I like Catman because
Mhm.
Catman is just so eccentric. It's just
Yeah.
his vocal ticks, you know.
Yeah. He
He
definitely
was
is one
like,
of the most eccentric singers of all time.
yeah, like vocally, he was like Elvis on crack.
Yep.
That's what I always liked about Gene Vincent.
Yeah.
Let's see. Some other guys we have here. Eddie Cochran. Eddie
Da 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 da
Cochran.
da da
Yeah.
da da.
Eddie Cochran was basically like a cleaner version of Gene Vincent. He also died. His life was cut short. He died in a car accident. But his most famous song was "Summertime Blues," a song that would be made even. Well, he had the most famous version, but both Blue Cheer and the Who would have incredible, like almost heavy metal versions of that
Oh
song.
yeah, I mean the Who's version of "Summertime Blues" is just absurd.
Yeah.
Like Keith Moon on that is just yeah, absolutely absurd.
Let's see who else we got here. We got to mention Roy Orbison. Chris, what about Roy Orbison?
Well, Blue Velvet wouldn't be as memorable without Roy Orbison for sure. But Roy Orbison, great crooner, one of the great rock and roll singers of all time. Drama on top of drama. Great songwriter. Coolest looking shades. And he just like exuded rock and roll, but he was a balladeer essentially.
Yeah,
I mean,
Elvis like actually envied his vocals. Elvis wanted to sing like Orbison.
Right. And, Orbison, some of the famous songs, In Dreams, and Crying, which has been covered by hundreds of people. And so he had this drama where we kept building, and in the dictionary under crescendo, there or if it was an online dictionary, there would be an audio excerpt of like the end of, I don't know, 17 of his songs. He always ended on the high.
Yeah.
So,
Oh Pretty Woman, his most famous song. He's the only person of the 1950s rock and roll era who actually had a hit along the same time the Beatles busted out.
Pretty much. And he's also a traveling Wilbury.
Exactly. He was the first traveling Wilbury to die.
Yep.
Anyway, Screamin' Jay Hawkins. What can you tell us about Screamin' Jay Hawkins, Chris?
Novelty on top of novelty. His whole thing was like he was the original sort of crazy black vampire of rock and roll. Great line, by the way, about Screamin' Jay Hawkins. So there's a author lecturer in the San Francisco area named Mark Montgomery French, who basically he had a speech series that he took on the road, basically saying that everything great that was white was once black, as far as rock. Yeah. And he basically kind of credits Screamin' Jay Hawkins as like the first goth singer. And great quote. He says, "Come on, he had the skull on a stick. He wore rubber snakes. He had bones, and he sang about love in a tortured way. It started there. Goth is really old if you think about it."
Yeah, but Screamin' Jay Hawkins, his thing was like Louisiana voodoo swamp shit.
Yeah,
that's what he was going for.
Clearly. I mean, it was like Louisiana kind of. He
was a precursor to Dr. John, really.
Oh yeah, and but also kind of that kind of goofy, like campy theatricality. Obviously, Cramps. Cramps basically, it's like Arthur Alexander plus Screamin' Jay Hawkins.
Yeah.
Yeah, if you think about it. So,
but the shit Hawkins used, the iconography was very much Cajun voodoo. But anyway, all right. Speaking of ethnic diversity in rock and roll, Richie Valens, Ricardo Valenzuela, his real name, and of course his one major hit, La Bamba, and his life was made into a movie starring Lou Diamond Phillips back in 1987.
Yeah, one of the best rock and roll movies ever made.
It is a good one. Yeah,
sure. And like I said, obviously Richie Valens, he did La Bamba, and there were a few other songs that if you heard them, you'd know them. Died in that plane crash along with Buddy Holly, but Mexican hero.
Who did not speak Spanish.
Yeah. Oh, I know. I mean, he was from southern Texas too. I mean, he wasn't that far from Mexico as far as I remember. But so kind of Hispanic American who, and as far as I know, he learned to speak Spanish to record La Bamba.
Yeah.
That's kind of where it comes from. Great Los Lobos cover of that song too.
Right. Another guy. If there's anyone, speaking of people who got a lot of mileage out of one song, this next guy, Dale Hawkins and Susie Q. You classic rock lovers probably know the
CCR.
The Creedence Clearwater Revival version. The Stones did a version back in 1964 from their 12 by 5 album. Really good version too. But is Dale Hawkins' swampy, really low down, dirty version that is the original. According to Rolling Stone, one of the 500 songs that shaped rock and roll.
Oh, no doubt. I mean, that rhythm and that riff, it's kind of like taking a Chuck Berry riff and turning it on its head. It's kind of like a Chuck Berry riff upside down, in a lot of respects. And so, great song. That sort of, influence. It was like made for the white classic rockers on cocaine, for sure.
Yeah, for sure. And then finally, someone you're a big fan of, Chris.
Oh yeah,
Link Ray.
Love Link Ray. Big hit was Rumble.
Yeah.
Which, if you've ever seen Pulp Fiction, which is probably most of you, when Emma, or what's her name, Uma Thurman when she's walking sexily to the bathroom, it's Rumble. That's the song that's playing. So I guess you could call it surf rock, or you could call it. It was almost kind of like the most intense rockabilly imaginable. It was like it's like rockabilly slowed down, done angry, or either angry or depressed, whichever would you want to say. So Link, and he's California, and so big influence on him. I think that he, Dick Dale had the bigger hits, but Link Ray, a masterful guitar player. Yeah, and then of course in the late '60s, he kind of embraced, or the early '70s, he embraced the California song and made a couple of the best of those California records ever, which nobody bought.
Too bad. Poor Link. All right. Well, like all good things, they all come to an end, and the first golden age of rock and roll just blew out really quickly into this gigantic fireball, like great balls of fire, like Jerry Lee Lewis, and then it flamed out very quickly. By 1958, 1959, going into 1960, it was done. It really was. And what happened? Well, we know that white corporate America somehow tamed the rock and roll beast. It also didn't help that within a 2-year window, Elvis joined the army. This was in 1958. Jerry Lee Lewis gets caught marrying his underage cousin, again, 1958. Buddy Holly dies in a plane crash, 1959. Little Richard finds Jesus in 1957. Doesn't really officially become a minister until 58 or 59.
Yeah, he had to go to Bible college first in Alabama.
Exactly. And then in 1959, Chuck Berry gets arrested for having a fling with an underage girl and transporting her across state lines.
God bless the Commerce Clause of the United States Constitution. He took a 14-year-old girl across state lines. If she was only from in-state, he wouldn't have spent 4 years in prison.
I know, terrible. And then, of course, at some point, we had all that corny shit that came afterward before the Beatles. Neil Sedaka, Pat Boone, Yakety Yak, Don't Call Back, all those terrible songs. What the hell? Chris, you were a former music journalist. Put your investigative hat on. What the fuck happened?
Okay, so here's what happened. This was not a product, and you cannot blame white kids. You cannot blame white teenagers. You cannot blame musicians. You cannot blame anyone that did not have power. And so this is a combination of, I don't know if they necessarily collaborated all together, but it might as well have been. It's a combination of radio stations, corporate radio station ownership, the 5 major labels, churches and religious organizations, especially in the South, and civic organizations, and the music press. I mean, that's the most surprising thing. They were kind of all in cahoots, and I think it was motivated by basically two things: racism being one of them, but also there was, back in the 50s, there was a purity or a puritanical wave that because television was brand new, and so there was this fear of exposing kids or even anybody, like, nobody was used to sexual longing or sexual type of sentiments at that point. And so rock and roll is a product. There's a great book from 1993, and that's one of my main resources here, called Anti-Rock. And the authors, they did a lot of research on this. So that said, there were 5 major labels back then: Capitol, RCA Victor, Decca, Columbia, and Mercury. And before rock and roll, as rock and roll is coming up, it wasn't from them. It was it was all independent labels. It was, we've talked about, Chess and all those labels in Chicago. There were also other independent records labels as well. Elvis got his start with Sun Records, but he was the one, I believe it was RCA that kind of thrust him out into the mainstream. But independent records basically supported, promoted, and made rock and roll a thing. So at this time, you're coming off the age of the crooners. Frank Sinatra, Perry Como, Dean Martin, to a lesser extent, guys like Sammy Davis Jr., and just sort of these early Paul Anka, I think, was part of that set. And so that's where their money was in these pop singers that were doing these ballads or these sort of, drawn out or kind of hepcat kind of songs, Yeah. You got to remember Frank Sinatra in a congressional hearing in the 60s referred to rock and rollers as cretinous goons, kind of a famous quote. So the labels, as they're apt to do, remember, it's never to follow the white kids. There's always this divide, and you see it now. Pearl Jam, when we were 17-year-olds, that was the sound of rebellion and freedom. Now it's dad rock. Yeah. Nobody under the age of 40 gives a shit, or would see them as being anything dangerous. And it was kind of the same divide. But the labels, as they're apt to do, were, had no foresight. We know that they're always like, they want to protect what's making money now. And so here's a few things. One, black artists cannot get on corporate radio. That was basically by policy or by just, custom, racism. And so if those rock and roll hits, and we'll talk about this in a little while, if, Little Richard or Fats Domino was going to get on the air, it had to be filtered through a white recording artist. A cover was required. But more directly, in terms of what started to happen, is there was an attack on rock and roll as being this sort of this conduit for juvenile delinquency and kind of poisoning the minds of the kids, and this is not moral, and this type of thing, with the sexual the sexual connotations and double entendres and all that. And so it's like, we need to protect the kids. And so a lot of it was led by money, but a lot of it was led by where we were in the culture. And a lot of it was because of Alan Freed and others like him that were giving the black people or the black artists a forum and kind of serving as a little bit of a gatekeeper for white kids. And so, and you're talking at that point, like, 15 to like 25. And so, a lot of folks are getting into that, and it's like, oh boy, and so now is that same kind of staining of minds going to happen to the 11-year-olds, et cetera, et cetera. And so, yeah, they really pounded the shit out of them. In the case of Freed, here's what happened with him. He gets to New York. He has a show on 1010 Wins, of all things. Was doing rock and these kinds of things, and he would have the Drifters and Frankie Lyman and the Teenagers and some of those bands. They would all come in and play live. Actually, right. There was an audience there too, and would do that. He did that for a few years. He eventually was ABC hired him to do a dance party kind of thing, or like a big old party type. It was like kind of an American Bandstand kind of format. And in the second episode, Frankie Lyman is shown on camera dancing with a white girl, a white woman. And at that point, you remember we're 3 years removed from Emmett Till. So nope. And the Southern affiliates stations said said, no, we ain't putting up with that. And so that lasts only 4 episodes. Then he was sponsoring concerts, and he was, promoting concerts in which black artists and maybe a few white artists would be on these bills, and they would do these theater shows or arena shows, whatever the equivalent of arena show was back then. In Boston and in a few other places, the cops, this was their influence. There were these arrests for riots. They would say that riots would be breaking out at these shows, so that the idea is that the influence was, again, juvenile delinquency and chaos and those types of things. What really happened was the Boston show was in a bad area, and there were some stabbings and some muggings outside the arena. But also there was, freed from the stage, basically said the equivalent of go nuts out there, just, whoop it up out there. And so you had kids up in the aisles, and it was too small of a venue. It was oversold. And so, so there was a little bit of disorder, but the cops and the press referred to that as riots. And so, at that point, freed, that's what got him fired from 1010 Wins, I believe. And then he showed up on WABC for a while. And so that was the kind of thing that was happening. Again, you had sort of the music press that was really kind of crawling up his ass. So there was just all these pressures and all this intensity. And I think it was also an offshoot of Elvis. Elvis was dangerous, but it showed that like good-looking white people that did sort of rock and roll-ish type songs could sell records. And so that's where, between the attacks and the suppression and oppression, if you want to think about it, and sort of major label corporate influence, that's where like Fabian and Neil Sedaka and Connie Stevens, who Sedaka wrote her biggest hits, so he wrote a lot of those sort of beach songs. Frank, what was his name there? Frankie Avalon. And even like Frankie Valli, which was a couple years later, which is, kind of white doo-wop. I mean, that's where sort of this Dion was another one. That's where all of that came from. And so between 1960, it was like 60 and 61 were dominated basically by those artists. And as an exercise here to show this, God bless Billboard. And I can never actually find it on the Billboard website, and so I usually have to go through Google. They have every single Hot 100 ever published available on the website, which is really, really fascinating. So here is from March 6th, 1961, the top 10 songs in the country for that week. You've got Chubby Checker's Pony Time. We'll talk more about Chubby Checker lately, because he's a fascinating case of the whitenization and sort of neutering of rock and roll during this period. Number 2 is Elvis Presley's Surrender, which is one of his worst songs, and that was the beginning of his movie phase. I mean, that's just like shock. You've got Wheels by the String-Alongs, which you've got Don't Worry by Marty Robbins. Most of you out there know Marty Robbins because it's his song that's at the beginning of the last episode of Breaking Bad. The aforementioned Where the Boys Are by Connie Francis is number 5. Babysittin' Boogie by Buzz Clifford, which is sort of a novelty song. It's like a knockoff Buddy Holly song, but a baby goo-goo gooing and ga-ga-gaing on the chorus. Yeah. It's really ridiculous. Dedicated to the One I Love by the Shirelles, which, was made... Yeah, that's a pretty good song, and that was made famous by the Mamas and the Papas a few years later. Calcutta by Lawrence Welk, which, obviously Lawrence Welk is as square as it gets. But to be fair, that's actually a fun instrumental. Ebony Eyes by the Everly Brothers. I mean, this is where they started to get corny. That was sort of their, and we have the narrative of the spoken word, and, sort of Don Everly kind of, delivering the spooky poem. And then Spanish Harlem by Benny King. And so, what you see there is you see this sort of dominance of sort of that neutering, but also, and again, it was sort of, in a roundabout way. Yeah, the Beatles are the ones that kind of officially brought it back. But what you're seeing here, it's the beginning of it is the blacks do the rise. They get snuffed out by the corporates, the religiouses, the press, and all of that. And here comes the safe music for safe white kids, younger white kids. And then you get, the Motown, etc. And so it's kind of like the blacks from like Detroit and other urban areas that start to bring it back. So I think that kind of indicates where things were. And, we mentioned a couple of other people. Actually, before we move on, any thoughts about what I just put out there?
Yeah. So basically what it seems to me is that up until 1960, by the end of the 1950s, the parents of this mainstream white teenage audience that was buying all these records started to like make the links between rock and roll and Black people and rock and roll and African American culture and where it came from. And then it was kind of hammered by the point that you had all these package tours that were going on.
Yeah.
Alan Freed promoting many of them, where you would have Black and white artists performing on the same bill, not in the South, of course, because there was segregation there, but like in other parts of the country, we have white and Black artists performing on the same bill with white and Black audiences mixed together, integrated in the audience. And a lot of upper middle class and middle class white families did not like that. And I think a lot of that frustration kind of trickled upward to white corporate America. Am I right?
Yeah, absolutely. And to get back to Alan Freed for a bit, and this is part of what happened too. So like 1960, 61, but even before that. So the radio industry hated Alan Freed for obvious reasons. I mean, he was the only guy that had the balls to play the original songs by the Black artists.
Yeah.
But what happened is you got the dawn of payola. This is before payola was illegal. Payola is a term of art to describe labels and record executives paying off DJs and radio stations to play their songs.
To be fair to a lot of these Black artists in the 1940s and early 50s, it was probably the only way they could get on the radio.
Oh, yeah. And then there were a few other things, too. Remember, Alan Freed actually once, not anymore, but he once had a songwriting credit to Chuck Berry's Maybelline. And he also, still to this day, I think, has a co-writing credit to Sincerely by the Moonglows, Harvey and the Moonglows. Harvey Fuqua actually does say that that's legit, that, Alan Freed did do that. So that was another one of those bargains, give me some songwriting credit.
Jeez.
Yeah. And you're right. And so they had to kind of do that. And, but I think that the radio industry ran with that, the racism of like, okay, so not only are you, do you have the gall to put all those N-words on the air, but now you're taking money from those N-words, And so to them, it's kind of like the capitalist equivalent of like, Black guys, Black men hitting on white women in the South.
Yeah.
Oh, you don't do that. So basically Freed got blackballed, and by the time he's 43, he is dying of complications from alcohol. The last 10 years of his life, he was going from job to job, and he just, he died broke, basically.
Jeez.
So that's just sort of indicative of what was going on. And so let's talk a little bit about what I call the whitenization of these songs, these hit songs.
Basically, we're fast forwarding into the future, and we're seeing the white mainstream and its legacy. Now let's fast forward several decades, almost half a century. And then, with rock and roll, Black music hit the white mainstream audiences No, and it hit them before with jazz, obviously, right? The big jazz explosion of the 1920s and early 30s.
Sure.
But it didn't have the full gale, the full on force of early rock and roll.
No.
And like I said, the long term impact of this seismic event. Let's just analyze how this actually. Well, Chris, tell us how it forever opened the door for Black music shaping American popular culture. Let's just call it like it is.
Yeah, sure. And let me kind of go into the earliest forms of that, and then we'll get into sort of the larger picture. There's two guys I want to talk about now in particular, Pat Boone and Chubby Checker.
Okay.
And this is kind of the beginning of this. So Pat Boone, folks out there might have heard of Pat Boone. He's most famous as a gospel singer and as a lark. This shows you how like conservative Christian his Tennessee life was. As a gag, like 20-something years ago, he released an album of metal covers, and he was out there promoting it in like one of those sort of Judas Priesty leather outfits. And actually he got thrown out of his church for that. It was a Church of Christ, and they're the most conservative. They're the ones that basically are most famous for no live music, although they got or no instrumental music. But which is not the case anymore. But anyway, so Pat Boone is this square country. At the time, he was kind of singing country rock and all that. But what happened is he kind of became the go-to for recording. These songs are famous with, like Little Richard's Tutti Frutti, had blown up with the white kids and was already very, very, very popular by 1957. However, as I said, corporate radio had a policy of not playing Black artists, but they knew that the song was really popular, would boost their ratings, and would work. And so Pat Boone covers Tutti Frutti in like the most cheesiest, most ridiculous, corniest way. Pat Boone could sing. He was a good singer. He was a really, really good singer. But him going out there trying to like capture Little Richard's rhythms was just ridiculous.
And I'm sure he didn't know that Tutti Frutti meant anal sex.
Oh, probably not. Well, nobody did. I mean, the fact is if they knew that, or originally was about that, which I find kind of funny. Here's a YouTube comment that basically perfectly describes it. This is rock music for Ned Flander types. Ned Flander, obviously the nerdy neighbor from The Simpsons, which I thought. Yeah. But he also, Boone did a cover of "Ain't That a Shame," which is not bad. Although a lot of these just had those sort of milquetoast homogenous sort of mainstream arrangements where you have a little bit of piano, you've got like some harmony vocals down in the mix, and this sort of straightforward, Pat Boone's voice way up there. And again, but it also is allowed to have a little bit of echo, and tenor, richness to it. And then had a cover of "I'll Be Home" by the Flamingos, which is a tremendous song, but in Pat Boone's hands, not really. And there's other examples like that. He had a top 50 hit with "Good Rocking Tonight" by Roy Brown, which is not a bad version until you hear Roy Brown and Elvis's versions. And then you're like, okay. So this was a safe white guy from Tennessee, a good Christian boy, doing safe versions of dangerous songs, or that were dangerous to, the establishment. Right. And so that, in a way, and then Neil Sedaka was influenced by doo-wop and sort of early black pop, and but also he was the ghostwriter for a lot of the beach hits, Connie Francis and all of that. So again, safe versions of sort of black street music, and if it hadn't have been for the Beatles and the Stones and the Who, they're the ones that brought back the unsafeness. And then obviously, white capitalists in their 40s, being what they are, Beatles come along and it's like, holy shit, we can actually make money on this, or maybe it's a good idea. And then obviously the Motown sound comes out and says, oh, wow, it was much more palatable to talk about love than sex,
Right.
Truth. This is actually true. Smokey Robinson wrote "My Guy" and "My Girl" on the same day.
Huh.
Yeah,
Wow.
so that guy could crank them out. So if you talk about love and about like puppy love or crushes, yeah, he'd
Yeah.
get on the radio. If you talk about fucking, or if you're doing like double entendres on hitting on 14-year-olds, then no. Although Steely Dan kind of brought that back, like in the 70s. And so yeah, it was worth talking about Pat Boone because and then he's been famous and he's still around. I don't think he's recording, but he's 90 years old. Or almost 90, but he became a famous gospel singer and a very conservative Christian. So that's one guy. The other guy that I want to focus on is another fascinating case is Chubby Checker. We've already mentioned him. Chubby Checker is he's also African American. He grew up in South Philadelphia. Fabian, I think it was Fabian that did the Great Jukebox in the Sky, or whatever the name of that song is from Greece. They were high school classmates and basically best friends. Chubby, was charismatic, fairly handsome kid who just had one of these like, sterling personalities that everybody loves. Moms just they wanted to grab that cheek and, and all that. But he also was kind of a class clown type and apparently was a very good impressionist. Like he could sing like Elvis, he could sing like Fats Domino or whatever. And, he would sing at local talent shows. Well, somehow he connected with or met Dick Clark's wife and, charmed her, impressed her with all of that. And wouldn't you know, Chubby gets connected to Dick and, sort of auditions and, oh, we like him. We can use him. Well, about the same time, and remember, Chubby is about 17, 18 about this time. In 1959, there is an African-American singer, band leader, and songwriter named Hank Ballard. He fronted a band called the Midnighters, which were sort of doo-wop and sort of early R&B. Hank Ballard wrote The Twist, and he released that in 1959. It was a modest hit, at least on the R&B charts. He actually also invented the dance. I mean, most people know the twist. It's the stupidest looking thing ever. You put your hands out to the side, palms down, shake your hips, and yeah, exactly. Just kind of like it looks like it's like a rhythmic contortion. And if you listen to it, he's same kind of arrangement with the horns. Sort of then the piano and all of that, sings like literally, come on, baby. Literally, he's got that high register. Yeah. Well, here comes Chubby, who, he's more telegenic. He's 18 years old. Hank is a guy from Detroit who, comes from very black traditions, even though he had a charisma of his own. And so Dick Clark's like, oh, I can put this kid on American Bandstand. And this thing is cool. This could be a dance craze. At least somebody had the foresight to do that. Then they put Chubby out there and it blows up. Not only that, but remember, Chubby was an impressionist. He's basically doing an impression of Hank Ballard. Yeah. And the mix of it's louder in the mix. And, like the horns are so exaggerated. It's ridiculous. It becomes a massive, massive hit. And so now, basically, for the first time in rock, you've got a dance craze for, you had sock hops before that, but now you have this dance craze where now all of a sudden, even in like 1962, your grandmother is doing the twist at a wedding, That's how much it broke out. So Chubby does have a legacy for this. And in the late aughts, and again in 2013, Billboard did an exercise where they released or they tabulated the all-time Billboard Hot 100. The Hot 100 being, and we went through it, that's the singles chart, weekly singles chart that counts. The Twist by Chubby Checker was the all-time leading and top-selling single of all time.
Jeez.
Yeah. Like 15 million singles sold.
Not even the Macarena could top it?
Nope. No, I mean, Macarena was crazy up there, but nope. The Twist I don't know about anymore because, again, in the streaming area, era, I don't know how they quantify it anymore. But there's, obviously there's been some viral hits since then. I wouldn't be surprised if Long Dirt Road by Little Nas X is up there now because that was just an enormous hit. But there you go. But here's why I think that had a long-lasting legacy. This is not a safe, handsome white guy taking one of these dangerous songs by black men from the South and getting them on the radio and making it, your mom would be like, "Oh, honey, you can listen to that."
It was a cute, safe black person taking a song by some nitty gritty black R&B artist and making it safe for white people.
But here's the thing. It's like the safest song in the world. Yeah, it's not. And who knows, maybe it was, it would make for a clever sexual joke. It would be pretty subversive if you think about it. Maybe that was part of it. But you're talking about safe songs from authentically black artists from places like Detroit that are now getting co-opted by white America. Remember, Dick Clark has a lot to do with this. And they find the most charming, cutest, happiest young black man they can find, or that happen to be there. And he becomes a huge hit, and it really defined Chubby's career. I don't know what I think he was ambivalent about this, but basically he became the dance craze go-to for like 5 years. So, he had Pony Time. There were a few Limbo songs. His most well-known, the one that's actually survived, is Twist Again.
Yeah. Let's twist again.
Let's twist again like we did last summer. Which, I mean, that still survives, but more than the twist. But we have to mention that because yes, there is a history, a rock and roll history of safe black people, going out there and you take sort of the hot revolutionary genre and you put a nice safe black face on it. Donna Summer, I think, was part of. You can make an argument, even though she worked with Giorgio Moroder, she was kind of a safe face. Michael Jackson was a safe face until he did Off the Wall. And then there was that. I think that
years later we have Will Smith.
Yes, I mean that might be the most classic example, which is too bad because like him and Jazzy Jeff were actually pretty good. But they get Will Smith, who's this sort of really charismatic and well-mannered kid from Philly, from West Philadelphia. And, parents don't understand. I think I can beat Mike Tyson and just sort of comedy rock.
Right.
And, but, like Will Smith, even now, up until he like smacked the shit out of Chris Rock was, sort of the safest. Hey, it's like I can take my white children to go see like Men in Black, which for what it's worth, Men in Black is a great movie. Funny as hell. And so, yes, you do get that, but you also get, and hip hop's indicative of this too, that, and, sort of this is another one of these trends that you get, and one of these legacies of this period is one, segregation has never really broken in the music business. Now, maybe the audience, obviously, white rock bands are, in terms of in the mainstream, are pretty much dead. I mean, there might be like Coldplay and a couple other young bands like Turnstile for some reason is up there in the mix. But there's this grand tradition of, you go from Arthur Crudup and Muddy Waters to Elvis. You go from Little Richard to Pat Boone, Run DMC to the Beastie Boys, doo-wop to Neil Sedaka and Frankie Valli, Frankie Knuckles, who is a Detroit house music pioneer, to these days David Guetta. And so you get a lot of that. But even another would be like Dale Hawkins to Creedence Clearwater Revival. And so eventually, and then obviously, Vanilla Ice. I mean, come on, you get like Big Daddy Kane. Basically, what Vanilla Ice was doing was Big Daddy Kane shtick, but in fancier clothes. Yeah. And so it was like the LL, Big Daddy Kane, the sort of the handsome rebel guy that is out there doing sort of pop shtick and kind of like, fake tough guy. and sort of fake heartthrob, and obviously making a gazillion dollars from it. So so that's one of the legacies of this. Before I go on, any thoughts?
Yeah, it just it's pretty sombering. They're just mentioning that segregation is never really broken, but it has broken with the audience. I agree with that. But in the presentation of the work, of the art, of the music, you still see and you feel the traces of it. It's still this not quite completely over. You kind of feel it. It's the legacy of America, really.
Yeah, and the
You know?
Beasties still don't get on black hip hop radio
Yeah.
stations,
Yeah.
which is kind of amazing. At least the Paul's Boutique stuff, you would think, or Check Your Head stuff would get on there, but that doesn't have, so it works both ways. And so yeah, you've got
But
that.
then how do you explain Eminem? Because Eminem, when he came on, Eminem got play on genuine, legit hip hop radio
Oh yeah,
stations.
I mean there's obviously there's rare exceptions. I mean, Living Color was accepted as a black rock band. Seven Dust.
Yeah,
Say what you want about the quality of their stuff, but the fact that they had what's his name, their Angelo, or I can't remember his name, the kid from really charismatic kid from
yeah,
Atlanta. And so
yeah.
yeah, once in a while you do get black rock bands or black metal bands that, like African American metal bands, that do get there. And so you do have your accepted, like Lil Nas X fooling everybody into thinking he was a country artist,
Yeah.
which one of the great subversive moves in the history.
It ends up being a gay black hip hop artist.
Yeah, and not even hip hop. He's more like
R&B.
he's a chameleon. I mean,
Yeah.
he's really talented, actually. But and I think he's going to go down because he's kind of the equivalent of Chuck Berry in the sense that he, like guys our age can't conceive of how somebody could use SoundCloud and TikTok and work
Yeah.
at it for years, and then finally figure out how to do it. And then he breaks out, and then he does all this great stuff. And so yeah, there are exceptions, but that segregation and like I said, the black artists are always out of the gate first, always.
Yeah.
So that there's no exception to that. But yeah, and to your point, by the way, about Eminem, black listeners and black aficionados, hip hop heads or R&B heads or jazz heads or whatever, are much more accepting of credible white artists than the other way around.
Right.
It, like the Lil Nas X or Lil Troy thing rarely happens. I mean, there's a reason, like, think of like black country superstars, Charlie Pride, Darius Rucker, who, if he hadn't been for Hootie, he wouldn't have never gotten in.
Right.
And
Right.
that might be the list. I mean, there's a couple others. Like the Pointer Sisters got away with playing the Grand Ole Opry, which is incredible. But yeah. So just a lot of these things are there. And so just one other thing to mention too is that rock and roll, like you said, Rocket 88 by Ike Turner and his band, Jackie Brenson was the singer. That's 1951. Well, that's the dawn of the television era, is 51 to 56.
Yeah.
And I think there's a legacy there too, that without television, like again, American Bandstand and Alan Freed's show, and some of the influence, like the Flintstones, or sort of this incorporation of rock and roll references. Television has a large part to play with that.
Sure.
MTV finally caught on to that and made it a sensation in the 80s. And so it's a visual medium too. And so in a way, there's this loop that happens where sex scares and leads to that that leads to that sort of cleaning up and that sort of Christianing of in terms of consumability, and it leads back to sex sells.
Yeah. Sex scares. Oh, let's clean it up. Okay, now let's sell it.
Yeah. And again, and it's like, yeah, exactly. You've got a good trail of telegenic white men, that kind of, and then black men too. And that was a thing too, because, we got to remember most of those early African-American artists were ugly motherfuckers. And so then Michael kind of broke the mold, Michael pre-surgery. And then there were a few others. And once they get widespread on television, Prince and those kinds of things, it's like, all of a sudden, we still don't want them sleeping with our daughters, but, hey, we can.
They seem like nice young men.
Yeah, exactly. And I know that's cynical, but it's true. And so, rock and roll's formative years are fascinating in the sense that you've got all these parochial influences that because of radio, because of the migration into markets like Chicago and St. Louis and Detroit, because of the rise of radio at that point as a widespread thing. And not only that, but also this is a point that the book Anti-Rock makes, is that television, one of the effects it had is that, radio programming that was famous was, like War of the Worlds kind of shit,
Right.
and sort of plays and sort of talky and sort of more that sort of entertainment. Well, that all moves to television. So what is radio going to do? So now they start pumping up the music, which obviously gave Alan Freed and also the white stations their run. So, I mean, that's so the story basically is these parochial folks, mostly black, they create this, it rolls up, you get a few geniuses that put it together, they get some exposure, and then it smooths out and it's not so regional. And then the white corporate types take it and, Elvis walks into Sun. You do that, it becomes a huge commodity. And then eventually it goes back to this sort of multiculturalism and blows up and becomes elevator music, essentially, by 2005. And so just culturally, rock and roll is still dangerous. It may not quite be rock and roll. One final thought. I don't understand TikTok, but I'm not supposed to.
Right.
And that's what you got to remember. There's always something. It's never the kids. It's the kids that find things that revolutionize the world before the adults. Right. That was the case with punk. That was the case with hip hop. That's the case with, trap.
Electronic music, techno, name it,
house, you name it. And then, some of the more like trap music these days, it's like everything is trap. Trap is kind of its own thing. And then not only that, but also this kind of the social media thing of, putting an 11-second snippet in a video, and all of a sudden people seek out the song and it becomes like an enormous hit. And then the adults co-opt it. And first, it's music to piss your parents off to. Think about it. Back then, Chuck Berry is dangerous. Brought up on those charges, what they called riots and all of that. And then by the early '80s, you got like two depressed, disturbed metalheads listening to, I believe it was "Stained Class" by Judas Priest, going out into one of those old school merry-go-rounds on a playground and blowing their heads off with shotguns. One of whom lived, by the way. His aim was bad. Shot off his face, and he made it a few more months before he died. And then that leads to litigation, where it basically, hey, heavy metal killed my son. Ozzy Osbourne obviously was involved in one of those around the same time. So, and this is where it all starts. And so, big picture, white, black, black, white, white, black, 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 with white audience. Black, 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 black.
And I think also the rock music in general, like as the decades go on, what you see starting in the 50s to the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, you have all these different subgenres of rock as rock continues to, and it's still kind of evolving now, even though it's not a mainstream pop cultural force anymore. And but the last time it was arguably the 1990s and maybe a little bit into the noughties, into the early to mid noughties. So from the 1950s up until then, rock went through many different cycles of like, okay, dangerous, then sanitized. A new kind of rock and roll comes up, gets dangerous, sanitize.
Yeah.
Dangerous, sanitize. And it happens all throughout the hippie rock of the 60s,
Absolutely.
heavy metal, glam rock of the 70s,
Grunge.
later punk rock, which became new wave, then later grunge, and then it kind of ended in the early to mid noughts. That's when, all the radio stations became monopolized. Thanks, Clear Channel.
Yeah.
And rock and roll basically got squeezed out of, formats. And now we don't have a rock station in New York City anymore. But anyway,
yeah, exactly.
That's another story.
Yeah, we only have one left in Houston, modern rock station that still plays like songs from Green Day's Dookie. So that ought to tell you something. And it's kind of funny because, like, the Brooklyn kind of James Murphy thing.
Yeah.
I don't know. Maybe people were just too lazy to sanitize that. That never really got its sanitation.
Well, you know why? It never went mainstream enough.
Exactly. By then it was, like we've said that at some in previous episodes of Curmudgeon Rock Report that at some point the bands that broke were like neighbors of writers that lived in Brooklyn and Seattle.
Yeah. And breaking didn't mean going multi-platinum and selling 5 million records. It just meant getting on the cover of Spin and getting in the top 10 of the Village Voice. That's it.
Yeah, exactly. And then building a cult through internet distribution and sort of, word of mouth. So with that, do we have any final thoughts, Arturo, to bring this home?
Yes, I do. It's a very sobering way to end the first golden age of rock. But this will segue into our next episode, because this episode was the first time that raw, primitive rock and roll hit, mainstream music audiences. We're going to fast forward 50 years into the future for the next episode, when the last time that raw, primitive, dirty, gritty rock and roll hit the pop music mainstream, and quite possibly the very, very, very last time, and that we'll never see it again. And we're talking about the White Stripes. And we are going to talk about the White Stripes. We're going to talk about their legacy. Yes, will be a legacy episode. And their formation, their lifetime as a band up until their breakup. And we're going to talk about the possibility, were they the last truly great American rock and roll band playing this kind of raw, primitive, dirty rock and roll?
Yeah, that's a good question. The answer is probably no. Were they the last one to sell records and become famous?
Yes,
probably. So, I'm definitely looking forward to that. Jack White is one of the more eccentric, more interesting characters in modern rock and roll. And so going through his legacy will be tremendous. Well, folks, we're going from the 50s back into today. And as always, if you have something to say, if some of this race analysis rubbed you the right way or even the wrong way, curmudgeonrock@gmail.com. We'd love to hear from you. We have a Facebook community page, which, we have a few regulars. Shout out to some friends of ours. For sure, and that's at facebook.com/curmudgeonrock. We're also on Twitter, at least until Elon Musk destroys it. And we're at Curmudgeon Pod. We're pretty active on that. We love to troll conservative country singers, but also extol the virtues of the bands we love and coverage of them.